Welcome back. In this video, we will discuss requirements verification and validation. What is verification and validation? Verification determines whether the product of some development activity meets its requirements or not. For example, this is like doing the things right, whereas validation assesses whether a product satisfies the customer's needs, that is, doing the right things. So verification determines whether you have written the requirements right. That is, your requirements have the desirable properties of excellent requirements or not. Whereas a validation of requirements assesses whether you have written the right requirements. That is, do they trace back to the business objectives? Therefore, validating requirements allows the teams to build a correct solution that meets the stated business objectives. So, an important question regarding requirements verification and validation is that when we need to perform the verification and validation activities. So in fact these activities, they need to be performed at every stage during this process. For example, they may be performed at the elicitation stage in order to, for example, we can check back with the elicitation sources. For example, the sources who have elicited the requirements. This might be some end users or the representatives of the team who were there to elicit the requirements. So once we have the requirements, we may consult those sources just to validate that whether this is the actual set of requirements that you want in your product, or is there anything different that you want. Then similarly, this activity may be performed at analysis stage in order to check that the domain descriptions and the requirements, they are correct or not. Similarly, at specification stage, this verification and validation may be performed, and mainly is here we are concerned with checking whether the defined system requirements will meet the user requirements under the assumptions of the domain or any other environmental constraints. Also checking the conformity to well-formedness of the rules and standards is also a consideration here. Now we will see what are the inputs and outputs of the validation process. So this process, as you can see here, it has three inputs, that is requirements document, the organizational knowledge, and organizational standards. So requirements document, we are already familiar with that. So it should be a complete version of the document that we are going to validate. It should not be an unfinished draft because there are in that case possibilities that some important information might be missing and that might not be validated. So the second one is organizational knowledge. For example, the knowledge about the organization, which may be used to evaluate the realism of the requirements. For example, it may contain some domain knowledge of the organization. Then knowledge about organizational standards. For example, local standard, for example, like the standard that the organization is going to follow for the requirements document. Then the outcomes of this requirements validation process is a list of problems that are discovered during the requirements validation process in the requirement specification document. Similarly, another outcome of this validation process is a list of agreed actions. So these are actually the actions that would be performed in order to fix the issues that were found in the requirements document or that were identified during the validation process in the overall set of requirements. Here we will see 6 principles to requirements validation. So the first of these principles is involved with the correct stakeholders. That is the individuals who know much about the requirements and can verify whether the requirements that are being presented for validation are the genuine needs of the users should be involved in the validation process. Then a separate error identification from error correction. That is, when we are identifying the errors during the requirement validation phase, we should not start correcting those errors right at that time. For error correcting, we have another, of course, phase where we can correct the identified errors. Then validate requirements from different perspectives so that we can reach a consensus about the validity of the validity or correctness of the requirements. Then the next principle is try alternative formalisms. Like, of course, we can think of drawing some, for example, use case diagrams to understand the goals and interactions among different actors. Similarly, state machine diagrams might be developed for transition analysis or class diagrams for architectural concerns. So such alternative formalisms may help in highlighting the ambiguity in the requirements. Then the next principle is build development items from requirements. For example, we may think of developing some test cases from the requirements or some architecture diagrams, or even we may think of developing some user manuals. Then the last one is that repeat the validation step. That is, we need to perform all these activities until we are sure that there are no problems or deficiencies in the requirements. Requirements verification and validation techniques. So there are several techniques for validating the requirements. For example, prototyping, reviews and inspections, simulations, and formal checks. So we will discuss these techniques one by one. The first technique, prototyping. In fact, prototyping in like in prototyping, a partial implementation of the requirements is done for validation with the customers. For example, the customer provides the feedback on the partially implemented set of requirements, and the rest of the requirements are based on the feedback on the requirements. The rest of the course of action could be adjusted accordingly. Then the second technique is reviews and inspections. In fact, in reviews and inspections, a group of people reads and analyzes the requirements to look for some possible problems or issues, and to agree on a list of action items that are needed to address the identified problems. So reviewing requirements is in fact a powerful technique for identifying the ambiguous or unverifiable requirements. So like the reviews, they are in fact they vary in their nature. For example, reviews might be formal reviews. Similarly, they might be informal reviews. So the formal reviews in fact follow a well-defined process. A formal requirement review produces in fact a report that identifies the materials that were examined and the review team's comments so that they could be adjusted or they could be corrected accordingly. Whereas inspection of requirements document is one of the most important quality techniques. In fact, several organizations they have avoided several hours of labor for every hour they invested in inspecting the requirement document and other software deliverables. So inspection is also a very well-structured technique with defined roles for participants, and it serves as an important quality gate for examining the work products for like defects before passing them to the like subsequent or upcoming phases of the project. Then the next technique is for verification and validation of requirements is simulation. Like in simulations, we simulate the environment of a system and check the appropriateness of a specified behavior. For example, if we have to simulate or test the behavior of a particular system in terms of its scalability, we may simulate that in using some simulation tool. Similarly, formal checks, uh, informal checks, model checking technique is applied to determine whether a model of system meets a given specification or not. Here we will discuss the elements of requirement review checklist. In fact, review checklists are essential tools for effective review process. Here is a checklist that can be used while performing the review activities. The elements of this checklist include comprehensibility, redundancy, completeness, ambiguity, consistency, organization, conformance to standards, and traceability. So first one is comprehensibility. That is can readers of the requirements understand like what uh, uh, does the requirement or set of requirements mean. Similarly, redundancy, is information unnecessarily repeated in the requirements document? If yes, it has to be highlighted and reported. Then completeness, does the checker know of any missing requirement uh, in the requirements specification being presented for the review? Then is ambiguity, like okay, are the requirements expressed using the terms which are clearly defined, or like are there any ambiguities in the requirements? Then consistency, like do the descriptions of requirements include any contradictions? Are there contradictions between individual requirements and like the overall requirements of the system? Then organization, are the requirements or like is the requirement document structured in a sensible way, and are requirements organized so that the related requirements could be grouped logically? Then the next element is conformance to standards, does the requirement document and individual requirements do they conform to the defined standards? And traceability, do the links does the document include the links to the related requirements and to the origin of different requirements? In the end, it is important to associate a fit criteria for each requirement. This criteria actually serves as the acceptance or rejection criteria for the requirements. Uh, for example, here we have a requirement for new ATM software. So the requirement is that the software shall be intuitive and self-explanatory. So, in fact, intuitive and self-explanatory, these two are some subjective terms and whose meanings are hard to define unless we associate some fit criteria, that is quantifiable or measurable. So here we have a fit criteria. For example, 95% of existing bank customers shall be able to withdraw money and deposit checks within 2 minutes of encountering the product for the first time. So that is in fact more elaborate than just saying that the software shall be intuitive and self-explanatory. But choosing a good fit criteria is in fact tricky, as the stakeholders are really that much specific. So the right criteria might not, of course, be the obvious one. Therefore, the stakeholders need to construct their own mappings from requirements to fit criteria. So that's all about our discussion on requirements verification and validation techniques. In the next lecture, we will discuss a new topic. Thank you. The materials in this video are based on these three sources. For more details, you can consult these sources. Thank you.